Welcome back to World War Now, everybody. I'm your host, Conrad Franz, joined as always by Dmitry Kalyagin. We have a very special guest with us today. We're going to discuss a whole wide range of subjects across the world, from recent bombardments in Crimea, crises in the Caucasus. We're going to talk about Kazakhstan, possible mask mandates and QR code technocracy nonsense coming back. In 2023, we thought we were done with all of that, but it really never ends. But we're joined again by the fantastic Hrvoje Moric from the Hrvoje Moric show. We'll give him a chance to introduce himself in 1 second. Dmitry, how are you doing?
Doing great, Conrad. Excited to have our guest here with us. It's a special guest episode. We haven't had one in a little while, and Claudia, of course, will provide us with the utmost, up-to-date takes, I think. Also, just another different opinion, frankly. You've been hearing from myself and Conrad for, a little while about the events happening in the news, geopolitics, religious issues, as well as, we do speak about conspiracies, and also just the idea that all of these subjects are intertwined, and I think an additional perspective, especially for this week, would be much appreciated. So we welcome our guest on, and I look forward to sort of speaking about these subjects here.
I'm pleased to be on, and it's I think it was in the early days when you guys started. Somehow I forget how we got connected, but from the very beginning, I've been following World War Now, and it's an honor to be on.
Thank you so much. It was one of those things where I wanted to have you on so long ago. You were, I believe, the first person who had me on their show since we started this. So it's only appropriate that we finally returned the favor. But Hrvoje and I have a lot of guests on, even across America. But even though he may be an international guest, we're actually not too far away. He's down under over there in Mexico, not far from me here in Central Texas. And he is sort of an international man of mystery himself. So, after his, delightful introduction, I'd like to give, Hrvoje the opportunity. What are you known for? What are your shows? Where can people find you? And kind of what's your background in geopolitical analysis?
Yeah, I'm down here in Mexico, and you are up there in what used to be Mexico, old Mexico, right? Yeah, I'm originally from Chicago, so proud American. But I'm ethnically a Croat, and I identify first as a Croat, funnily enough, fluent in Croatian. My name literally means Croat. My parents emigrated from Yugoslavia, but they're Croatian, and so I've moved back and forth between the two worlds. As I was a youngster, and then basically, I studied history and education in Illinois, and then in the 2000s, I sort of fell down the rabbit hole, and I came to realize America as an empire. Learning about state terrorism, false flag operations like 9/11, and then how everything works, basically the Federal Reserve and all that. And I just decided I wanted to permanently expatriate from the US, and other things. I love foreign cultures. I love to really go to a foreign country, learn the language, dig in, become like the locals, and so my ticket out was Peace Corps Mongolia. So 2006, I was out living in a yurt in the Gobi in a minus 30 weather. Fantastic. I was intermediate in Mongolian at the time, but I lost most of it, and then came back briefly to Chicago, and then decided to do a master in international relations at the Geneva School of Diplomacy in Switzerland. 2009, I finished. Some of my professors were, for example, Dutch-American lawyer, international lawyer, Curtis Dobler, who was Saddam Hussein's defense counsel. They asked him to defend Saddam. I had Yasser Arafat's brother-in-law, Ibrahim Sous, is my professor. Alfred Zayas, who's often on RT, former UN special reporter, really cool guy. He was my professor, and so those were sort of the people. Gorbachev was supposed to come to my graduation because they invite as an honorary guest every year. As part of the thing what they do. He couldn't come. His right hand man, I forget his name now, Boris something, came. And then, by the way, mentioning Kazakhstan, Tokayev was the honorary dean of Geneva School of Diplomacy. Not at the time that I was there, but I think a few years later. And so basically after Geneva, I said, the world is my oyster. And I applied for jobs everywhere. Alaska, Saudi Arabia, Afghanistan, Mongolia. I ended up in Mexico teaching at the top school, Tec de Monterrey, which is a globalist institution. It's directly linked to the World Economic Forum. And so I taught here, started my podcast while I was a teacher. Geopolitics and Empire. And then 2017, I got tired of Mexico for a while. I love Central Asia because of Mongolia. And then I ended up getting hired at the Nazarbayev Intellectual School, which was set up by Nursultan Nazarbayev or his fund. And so I basically worked in Semey, that's not far from the Russian border, northern Kazakhstan, for 3 years until COVID hit. In the meanwhile, I got to meet Gorbachev on a trip to Russia. And I even got to visit the Polygon, the principal Soviet nuclear test site where Stalin dropped the first bomb in 1949. I actually stood on one of the ground zeros where nuke fell. And yeah, when COVID happened, I just ran back to Mexico. And then I got hired on TNT Radio last year. So I've been doing TNT Radio daily and then keeping up with my podcast weekly.
Well, that's fantastic. We're going to have all of those things linked below. You can catch me. I've done 2 appearances on TNT Radio. Maybe I'll do some more if you guys respond well. I know you will. This is going to be a great episode. But Hrvoje, let's just dive right into some of these subjects. We talked about the Mexico connection. We'd be so wrong to ignore just probably one of the biggest global issues right now affecting this empire that I currently reside in, with this completely porous border from your country here into my country. Yet it seems that I'm much more at risk of any sort of consequences of this. You actually seem to be okay. We were talking about this before. So I'm wondering your thoughts from a broad empire perspective, as someone who's observed the rising and now what appears to be the last few years, the fall of the unipolar globalist American empire, now that we are apparently letting in 300,000 migrants a month at our southern border, mostly coming into my fantastic state of Texas. I'm wondering your thoughts on this. Is this, I mean, to me, like, there has to be, I mean, we know this, but like, there's people that want this to be happening and that are making sure it happens, right?
I think that's the principal thing. You guys probably know Alex Craner, who I've had on the podcast. I need to get him back on. We almost met last year because he's a fellow Croatian, also speaks Spanish because he was in Venezuela back in the 90s, and I think he's out in Monaco now. And he served in the Croatian forces. He told me that, migration at this level that we're seeing, it's a military tactic or strategy. It's a weapon of war. You had Greg Abbott 2 days ago put out. He said, I officially declared an invasion at our border because of Biden's policies. We deployed the Texas National Guard, DPS, and local law enforcement. We're building a border wall, razor wire, and marine barriers. We are also repelling migrants. And, I think this is the goal of the globalists. There's so much documentation about this. Just off the top of my head, I remember this article from BBC many years ago where they interviewed Peter Sutherland, I think is his name, who was this, elite establishment figure who's attended Bilderberg. And he himself was in this BBC article saying basically between the lines that, yeah, we need to bring in a lot of migrants into Europe, and then he mentioned like UN and stuff. And so, because for me, this is what I focus most on: geopolitics and empire. Empire is a synonym for globalism or world government, basically, because I think we're moving towards the final empire, the world empire, world government for the first time in history. And geopolitics for me is like the science of politics, like, which includes the study of demographics, technology, economics, culture, all this stuff. And so I think the goal is to break down nation states. Then once you do that, you create a supranational structure, and then beyond that, the United States is the number one target, because many people have said that once America falls, the rest of the world is screwed. I had on Ricardo Bossi 3 years ago on my podcast, former Australian Special Forces, head of Australia One Party, and he was saying that, he was saying if America goes, that's it, because where else in the world do you have this culture, of quote democracy and love of liberty and freedom and so many guns, right? There's really nowhere else. So if that American ethos, if economically America collapses, politically and culturally, then we are pretty screwed. And so I think that's the name of the game. This is all deliberate. It's happening in Europe. The West is the principal target. Andrei Fursov, you guys know Andrei Fursov, the Russian intellectual. I've emailed with him. I love his work. And he recently wrote about I forget the title of it, but he was saying, he called it the dark something. I'll pull it up in the meanwhile. But he was saying that along the same lines. He was saying that the West is the principal target, Europe and North America, and the middle class is the main target. And so, yeah, that's my thought. And the purpose, again, if you have the idea of globalism is Babylon, right? Babylon, multicultural, destroy any homogeneous structure, family, tradition, religion, and then it is Brave New Worldish, where you don't have any structure, and so no one has nothing to believe in, nothing to defend, and then that's when you plug into the world government, and the building block is the regional union, right? North American Union, Central American Union, South American Union. We've got African Union. EU is the blueprints. Eurasian Union, ASEAN, and AMLO, Lopez Obrador, president of Mexico. He's done some good things to protect sovereignty of Mexico, but he's also a globalist on paper. He's called for world government. He recently said that he wants to emulate the EU model and integrate Canada, USA, and Mexico, basically to create a North American Union. And he's also said, let's go beyond that. Let's create an American Union. So he's literally said that. This is not conspiracy theory. It's in the interviews. And then you had Bukele of El Salvador say a month ago, this was shocking for me. He said, hey, let's create a Central American Union based on the EU. Let's unify all 7 Central American countries into open borders like the EU. And you had last year Rafael Correa of Ecuador, also ex-president of Ecuador, say, hey, let's emulate the EU in South America and create a South American Union. So I think migration is part of that process.
I think you're completely right. And it's great that you brought up the idea of the North American Union, because I've been hearing here in Texas, I've been hearing people. I remember I was learning to drive when I was 15. I was at the state driving school where you have to drive for a certain amount of hours with an instructor. And my random boomer instructor with a boomer ponytail was going off about how he was afraid that they were going to force the Amero on all of us here in Mexico, the US, and Canada, and we're going to have it just like the EU. And, I've been thinking about that ever since, that they do want to, that seems to be they've completely rendered the actual border right now meaningless. So at what point are you like, yeah, the Mexican government has failed. We're hearing all this talk about a war with the cartels, which, again, sure, a war on the American border fighting fentanyl sounds a lot more attractive than a foreign war in the Middle East. But let's not pretend that this wouldn't be 100% a pretext to basically further destroy any limitation between the US and Mexico government, and basically, I don't know, incorporate all the states of Mexico as to maybe territories. And then eventually we have our North American Union. Look at Canada. Canada is maybe on the brink of breaking up between Quebec. We're going to talk about their struggles with I mean, look, they've imported millions and millions of Indians, and now they're dealing with an ethnic religious Sikh Hindi conflict basically on their borders, just because they've forgotten what it meant to have immigration reasonable policies. And this is what happens. Of course, the cartel and fentanyl drug violence spills over into America. The ethno-religious conflicts of the third world end up entering your country. And here we are. And you mentioned, of course, the multi-regional superstates, and me and Dmitry have talked about how our fear is that, what'll happen is perhaps Russia will achieve some victory in Ukraine, and then the West will, kind of mold the situation to where we end up with, like you said, the Eurasian section of the broader connected, it's like the Hunger Games or whatever, the districts around the world in these different super regions, and then they eventually all meet at the Global Council or whatever the UN would become in this world, and then we're one step closer, if not already at the world government itself, right? And so I want to hear your thoughts on the Amero and the, like you said, the Mexico Union, and how in fact, that leads directly into, there's this talk of this new president. We're here all about the first female Jewish Mexican president. I'm wondering how would she approach the question of the of that American, Mexican, Canadian, North American, or a Central American Union. I want your thoughts on that. And I would love to hear if you have any thoughts on that situation up in Canada. Of course, Canada, I think, is, probably the most occupied World Economic Forum government in the world, if there was one.
Well, yeah, and I thought I'd mention, I forgot to mention, Raw Egg Nationalist, who I've had on my podcast. He just published for Border Hawk, "The Worst Is Yet to Come, Prepare for Climate Migration." And he says mass immigration has been used as a tool of deliberate social engineering in the West for decades. Our leaders have used it to make our beautiful nations virtually unrecognizable, to draw us to the brink of chaos. Given the chance, they will go further still. Even if they don't end up importing hundreds of millions or billions from the third world, with the threat of climate change, our leaders will have the excuse to bring as many people here as they need to realize their dreams of global government and the end of the nation state. And you know, when you mention Amero, I mean, this is not conspiracy theory. So, you know, I taught at the Tec de Monterrey. It's the only school in Latin America that goes to Davos. It's owned by FEMSA, this corporate conglomerate that's officially linked to World Economic Forum. In fact, the convenience stores that we have everywhere here, they're called OXXOs, like 7-Elevens. On the campus, the main campus of Tec de Monterrey, they are prototyping an OXXO that's cashless. You scan the QR code, you walk in, take whatever you want, and you leave. And then they're saying if that works, they're going to replicate it to the rest of Mexico, like hospitals, malls, you name it. So is it any wonder that they're prototyping that on the campus of the Tech, which is officially linked to World Economic Forum? And so my point is, Robert Pastor, who's known as the father of the North American Union, he would give lectures and visit at the Tech. I would attend those lectures. I've met him. And in fact, I've got his book, North American Community, I think it's called, or North American Idea. I actually assigned chapters of it in my classes when I taught North American scenarios at the Tech. And I believe I had the last living interview with him. He died of cancer January 2014, and I Skyped him into my class with my students December 2013. It's still up on YouTube. Dissident Thinkers, my old channel. And so yeah, their plan was North American Union, and so it's the plan, you know. And then when you mention, by the way, one thing I'll add, you know, we got the 2026 World Cup now. It's going to be held in North America. Canada, USA, and Mexico. I think that's intentional. It's part of that, because it's got to be economic integration, political and cultural. So that's part of that indoctrination process for prepping for North America. You guys probably know Daniel Estulin, you know, Russian former FSB in the 90s. He had the #1 Spanish show on RT, Erete en Español, that got canceled. Bilderberg book. He lives here in Cancun, Mexico. I got to spend a day with him many years back. I organized a conference for him in Guadalajara, and a cool guy. He had an interesting theory that when it comes to this regionalism, you know, mention Eurasian Union, North American Union, that maybe the name of the game now, maybe the globalization and the system that we have, nation states, you know, if you look at it from like a pragmatic or objective perspective, maybe they can't exist anymore. Maybe like the new rules of the game are regional unions. And so you kind of have to now move into that system. So I think that's also something to keep in mind. And Scheinbaum, yeah, I saw that article. I had on a guest on TNT yesterday, Robert Bito of Mexico Unexplained, and he was telling me he thought Scheinbaum is probably going to win. And then I saw this article from Jerusalem Post today, which says, I lost it somewhere here. Yeah, it says that Jerusalem Post, Mexico on track to have its first Jewish female president. She's the front runner, probably, but she's running against Xochitl Galvez, who's, you know, attended Davos. And my view is that going, but you know, you were talking about, I think off air, the mayor of Moscow, for example. My view is that most politicians are captured by the globalists, and that's like, we're talking, like COVID demonstrated this, and I paid attention in Mexico. We're talking mayors, you know, just all over Mexico, just random, you know, mayors of little cities in Mexico, governors of states, completely captured. You know, and just to give you an example, when I came back from Kazakhstan to Mexico, I was shocked to see all this public transport infrastructure they were building. Like there was no such development in Mexico. And I'm like, where's this coming from? What's this all about? And then you realize it's the green agenda. They want to take our cars away. So they're building mass public transport to say, hey, you're not going to need your car anymore. Look, we built all this public transport for you. And then I discovered Guadalajara is a resilient city. I'm like, what's a resilient city? And then I find on the actual, you know, Jalisco is the state here in Mexico where I'm at, the actual website of the government. It says it's resilient cities are financed by the Rockefeller Foundation. And it's basically a smart city. And then the documents say cashless. We want a cashless society, pre-crime, you know, all this crazy stuff. And I'm like, then the governor, Enrique Alfaro of Jalisco, he's in on this. There's no way, like it's open, it's openly says he's getting money from Rockefeller Foundation. They want to get rid of our cars. He was floating stuff like it's illegal to mandate vaccines according to the state constitution of Jalisco. He's like, well, we're thinking about changing the state constitution to allow us to mandate force vaccinate you. And he also said, we're also thinking about this idea. If you leave the state of Jalisco and to come back, you would need a passport. What do you call it? The passport certificate. They didn't apply that, but just the fact that they were thinking like that just shows you to what degree. And it's the same thing, where I was in Kazakhstan, in Croatia, to differing degrees. It's not every single politician at every level, but there's nuance. But there's some that are and some that aren't, and it's really a struggle, And so Scheinbaum, I think she was her. I've heard Hochitl, the other female, or her. AMLO's been pretty good so far. Even conservatives in Mexico have said he's been the least worst. But I think after AMLO, we're screwed. There's really no one kind of like AMLO. And Claudia's pretty globalist, Hochitl. Even this Marcelo Ebrard, this guy came out and announced Plan Angel, which I call Plan Diablo. He literally said, we need to roll out nationwide facial recognition, morphological detection, drone tracking, and an AI ecosystem to track everything. Again, that's that globalist system. So, yeah, it's not looking good in Mexico.
No, exactly. And I think that is mostly where you see the globalists kind of agree wherever they come from around the world. So you mentioned Sergei Semyonovich Sobyanin, the mayor of Moscow, the big pusher of QR codes, mask mandates inside of Moscow, which was broadly rejected by the very skeptical, I guess you could say, Russian people and even residents of Moscow who really, especially since the Soviet period, a lot of the Russian boomers just really weren't up for following more authoritarian sort of dictates of anybody, frankly, even Sobyanin, who's been around for about 20 years. But what's interesting is, again, in Russia today, they're moving to, mandate masking again in legal courts as well as in government buildings. So especially visitors for official ceremonies. And there were rumors, of course, now from certain journalists actually who went to film and also interview Vladimir Putin for some of the press conference since the beginning of COVID that, they did have to quarantine for, I think it was 2 to 3 weeks prior to being allowed in his vicinity, being in the same room as him, which is really curious that, it's kind of a trend we see around the world. And I'm not saying that Sobyanin is necessarily a bad guy. It's just simply this is the default state for a lot of these local politicians. They seem to believe, or maybe that's what their sponsors or some of their lobbyists, they argue that, hey, this is just the trend they have to push in their particular cities or regions which they govern. And look, in regards to mass migration, you mentioned it being a weapon. If any of our listeners think we're simply fear-mongering and this is a conspiracy of sorts and it's un-Christian, you should be welcoming of everybody. And it's like, no, this is a weapon of the globalists used in the modern era, and perhaps even an ancient weapon. Like, let's just think back to history. Like everybody's, memeing on TikTok about, everybody's husbands or, boyfriends are thinking about the Roman Empire. Well, let's just not forget. Let's think back to how the Roman Empire was destroyed. It was mainly because of mass migration. And, you can say it was more or less organic back then, but the globalists, they know their history even better than some of us do. So frankly, they studied how mass migration can destroy nation states, can destroy sort of foundational bodies of people, such as I guess you can say Native American people who, I consider the Anglo-Americans right now who have, invested into this land culturally, religiously, and have built up, households, families over the last 200, 250, 300 years. So those who have been in America for that long have built up what we know today as the United States. So those particular foundations would need to be eroded by migration. The foundational, families and cultures of Mexico would need to be eroded by those migrating from the south, from completely, you could say, foreign countries, nations, which are related maybe by language or, Spanish or Portuguese, but still they are not native Mexicans. And so this sort of this melting pot strategy is used. I think we can see it all around the world. Like Israel, we spoke a few weeks ago about the fact that the Eritreans, even the Israeli Zionists had issues with the Eritreans and they were about to kick them out. Netanyahu spoke very strongly about Eritrean refugees. Mind you, they had actual refugee status. So again, it's a little bit morbid, kicking out actual refugees. But I guess if they're rioting, it is what it is. And we've all seen France, right? Let's just know there are no more questions about exactly what was used in France. A sort of tactic to, I guess, a tactic by the globalists to put even Macron, who has been showing maybe signs of life, that he had certain sovereign aspirations or maybe independence. Thinking about France as an independent state, away from the EU, away from, as you mentioned, Hrvoje, that regional control territory, which the EU essentially is the prototype for. They want, I guess, most of these, like AFRICOM, for example, you mentioned, and the Americas all to be united under a certain economic, cultural, maybe even political and military alliance of sorts. The EU is the prototype. And as soon as Macron, starts to show some sort of signs of life, of course, he gets insane riots, which is still continuing to this day, and, hundreds of government buildings destroyed, lots of billions of dollars of damage. And look, let's just look at how countries which are somewhat trying to, again, free themselves from globalist influence are also reacting to mass migration. In Russia, today, there are almost on a weekly basis hundreds of illegal immigrants being apprehended by the police, by the FSB, by the internal Ministry of Internal Affairs forces. Essentially, you have SWAT raids on these apartments housing these illegal immigrants, on some of the gymnasiums. So a lot of these immigrants, they work, and they also, could aspire in martial arts gyms, for example. We've seen martial arts gyms raided by the Russian police, and not that I'm supporting feds raiding places, but it should be considered that Russia, for whatever reason, has begun cracking down on illegal migration. And this is Tajiks, Uzbeks, Kazakhs, not to even speak down upon these Central Asians, but who is letting them into the country in the first place? And they've been, allowed to sort of migrate with no issues into Russia for the last 30 years, pretty much in a very unhinged fashion, with no particular lashback. And it's also worthy to consider the fact that the Russian media as well, I'm not sure about RT in particular, but let's say Tsargrad, for example, it's a more right-wing version of RT, a more sort of orthodox, you could say, channel, which Alexander Dugin is a co-founder of. And Tsargrad has openly, almost on a fortnightly basis, has published videos speaking about these crackdowns on the migrants. And so they've kind of maybe gotten a green light somewhere from the Kremlin that, look, perhaps it's time to wake the Russian people up to this idea that illegal migration is actually a great evil. And of course, more examples we can bring about the Hungarians, obviously, mentioning the fact that migration is a threat to their nation and kind of locking themselves down. The Greeks and the Turks always having that immigrant issue, and that comes up intermittently every few years or so. And naturally, even a few days ago at the UN, the president of Poland accused Lukashenko of using illegal immigrants as a weapon against the Polish, even though, let's be real, I'm not sure what kind of illegal immigrants travel from Belarus to Poland. Like, I can't even imagine in my mind the people, but like maybe local Belarusians. I'm not even sure, frankly. It's not like that's a big deal compared to some of the other issues around the world, but certainly it is a weapon that's used by the globalists, and frankly, one of the few weapons, including the green agenda, global warming, which Zelensky actually did mention. He said the world is going to die in a few years because it'll get warm. I'm paraphrasing him. This is his speech at the UN, where he says, because the Russian war is distracting everybody. It's like, hello, did Greta Thunberg, like, I mean, I know Zelensky met her a few weeks ago, but really, did she really inspire Zelensky that much for him to speak about global warming at the UN? It's like, how much do people really need to be distracted by this issue? And it's quite shocking, but completely right. Illegal immigration should not be ignored. And I guess to kind of end it, especially for the Christian folks listening and thinking, well, this is boring, this is a non-issue. Of course, me and Conrad spoke about certain Orthodox Christian prophecies about mass immigration in the future, and especially in the future of Russia in particular. There are two prophecies about Chinese mass immigration into Siberia. And I just need to kind of put a disclaimer up that this is not to say anything is wrong with multipolarity, with Russian-Chinese relations, but these are simply prophecies given by Russian elders to the Russian people. There's no strings attached. It's not to say that Chinese immigrants are bad or that Russian immigrants are bad. This is just a prophecy that was given to us. In 1977, Schema or Kimandrite Seraphim Tyapochkin basically said, the seizure of Siberia by Chinese will not happen through military means. The Chinese, due to open borders, will begin to move en masse to Siberia. They will buy land, real estate, enterprises, apartments. Everything will happen in such a way that one morning Russian people will wake up in a Chinese state, not a Russian one. And then prophecy goes on, but that's the crux of it. That is the first two lines of the prophecy by Elder Seraphim. And again, Seraphim of Viritsa has a similar prophecy, which we've repeated previously, but very kind of curious that even Russian elders and saints, these are very esteemed people, I guess, even during the Soviet years, openly amongst, amongst their followers and amongst their fellow Christians spoke about the threat of illegal immigration, at least, somewhat eschatologically, you could say.
Yeah, I would just add, I read an article, Croatia soon, 25% of Croatia will no longer be Croatian. And, my wife is Mexican, so I married a brown person. My kids are mixed, and I'm lucky because no one can call me now a white supremacist. I'm Mexican, I'm a minority, you can't, and on top of that, I'm a Slav. So, the Aryan white supremacists were going to kill us. My grandpa was a Nazi prisoner. And I say this because I've had times on Twitter where I've had these probably feds try to make me out to be some pro-Hitler Nazi. I actually had this Canada Vice journalist getting funding from the Canadian government trying to associate me as some right-wing, Nazi, anti-Semitical fascist. And I actually had one of my listeners who's anti-Semitic and hates Jews put in a comment. He called my podcast, Jew Politics and Empire, because I don't obsess over the Jews. And I quote tweeted that Vice journalist, on Twitter publicly, like, look, here's the proof. My own listeners say I'm not, as you're saying it, because that's how they try to take you down. I thought I just mentioned that for fun, but yeah, when I was in Switzerland, when I returned to Switzerland to defend my thesis, the Swiss border guard was like, just questions that they ask, like, where's your permanent address? And I said it was in the U.S. And he's like, good. He was like, he didn't want me there. Try, doing this border stuff in Kazakhstan. You're gonna be kicked out quickly. So all countries maintain their borders, and so yeah, just and I've heard that theory before, that the Chinese will populate the Far East, Siberia, and so yeah, I think that's something to think about. By the way, you mentioned prophecy. If you think about the last days of Book of Revelation, something I often think about, I think there might be a big war towards the end, because John Patmos talked about he saw a sea of soldiers, something like that, right? That he counted 200 million, right? And I found this official U.S. government military assessment. I lost the bookmark. I got to find it again. But it was an official report which they assessed, if the U.S. went to war with China, how many men could China raise up in their conventional forces? And it literally said exactly 200 million. Just like the number that appears in Revelation. So, and then it talks about, John saw like red, right? Like red, which is associated with China and the dragon. And so I personally believe that eventually there will be a war between, maybe we'll call it, between the multipolar world and Pax Americana. I think at some point it makes sense with what we're seeing right now, geopolitically, secularly. If you add in the Bible as well, it kind of makes sense. I don't know.
Well, Hrvoje, you'd be fascinated by the prophecies of Saint Paisios, Elder Joseph of Vatopedi, some of these figures, because they talk about exactly that. They talk about the big war to come with Russia and Turkey, and then usually they say eventually, them perhaps being allies at one point, the Chinese will come in with armies of hundreds of millions, and the Bosphorus Straits, Constantinople, maybe even your homeland of Croatia. These places, they've always kind of been the center of the world. As a proud geocentrist myself, I believe that, Jerusalem truly is the center of the universe there in the Eastern Mediterranean. So I think that part of the world is always going to be relevant here. But, Dmitry, we talked about even, not controversial figures like Vyacheslav the Child. He spoke about, the whole things going out in the Chinese Far East and whatnot. And that was, in the 90s and 2000s. So, this has been on the minds of Russian nationalists and patriots who have seen, the rise of China and, Russia's perhaps not quite as fast rise, and the fact that they have that very unpopulated Far Eastern section, right? But Hrvoje, you talked about, just being accused by Canadian journalists. Again, I think Canadians are they really seem like the enforcers on, I love my right-wing Canadians. I know we love our Diagolon fans, and they're all that anti-hate stuff. I'm sure you've seen all of that, but it seems that outside of that, Canadians are they're like the enforcers of this nonsense, unlike the white man, like they run around, making sure everyone feels bad, calling everybody Nazis, calling everybody these things. And look, like if you stand up for anybody, I guess, that's white, or any country, I guess, that is European or Christian, standing up for itself, maintaining its sovereignty, you get called a Nazi, you get called all these things. And I mean, people need to remember there's only like 800, white people, Hrvoje, I include you in white people, Slavs, I may be an Anglo-German, but you're all right in my book, right?
I'm
But the
Mexican. Come on, I'm Mexican, all right?
yeah, well, you're a Castiza Mexican, right? That's where we're at. I'm saying there's only about 800 million people, and it's this. So are we minorities yet? Like, we're living the globalized world. When am I going to be able to claim minority status? Right? Like, is that what is? Doesn't that part of this?
Yeah, pretty soon you'll be a minority. I heard a funny story from a New Jersey teacher that I worked with. He told me he had a South African student, and you know how it is now. Everything's prioritized for the woke minorities and all of that stuff in the U.S. and the West when it comes to funding for university and all that. And the student, and he was telling this as a joke, but this was a true story. So a student, high school student from South Africa, wanted to apply for university and scholarship and all that. And he asked the teacher, "What should I put?" When it asked the different identities, ethnicities. Well, he's like, "Well, you're from South Africa. Put African." He was a Caucasian white, but he was from South Africa, so he was a South African citizen, and he had the right to put African, and he did, and he got the scholarship. So I think I thought that's a funny, kind of a ridiculous, but an example of how ridiculous all of this is. But he's African. White South African is African. So
Yeah, I think it's interesting how identity is still really important to people, especially those who have some connection to culture and especially religion. I think we've been talking before the stream began, how religion really does so closely tie us to culture and to exactly how we see ourselves ethnically, even, and tribally. It's all you can't really disconnect the two, or even these things are always somewhat tied together in the world, and we see that most pronounced, I think, in sort of geopolitical news, where we see conflicts between, say, the Palestinians and Israelis, or even in more recent news, the Azeri people and the Armenians, which frankly the recent conquest of Artsakh by Azerbaijan, especially, you can almost say somewhat bloodless, but it has come at a cost, and several Russian peacekeepers were killed, Armenian military staff, some civilians as well. So this particular conquest in the middle of September has essentially resolved the big issue for the Azerbaijani people, this Republic of Artsakh and in Nagorno-Karabakh region, which they wanted to take back ever since, again, this false division of the taking of Azerbaijani territory and marking it on the map as Armenia by the Soviets. Well, this is kind of like almost a post-colonial issue we've seen all around the world, in the Middle East and Africa, and again now we see it in a place most people maybe don't even associate this issue with, in the southern Caucasus and that particular region near Turkey. And Armenians are mourning the loss of Artsakh, but they should also consider the fact that, well, how many of them have actually traveled to the Artsakh Republic or even the Artsakh region in their lifetimes? Because I mean, frankly, most Armenians live overseas, so what's interesting about Armenia is, like, doing research, is the majority of Armenians are actually in a diaspora abroad, so in the United States and Russia, even Ukraine. So over 7 million Armenians are actually living abroad. Meanwhile, Armenia proper has roughly about 3 million people, and there is this relationship between the Armenian diaspora where they kind of push the idea of Armenian nationalism strongly onto the people at home. And in fact, we've seen Armenian nationalism somewhat backfire. We didn't see any uprisings against Pashinyan. We didn't see any. We just saw kind of mourning and sadness, sort of this useless depression, especially from those opposing Pashinyan. There are no coups. There is no call for a Maidan. There is no call for revolution, and it's almost as if Pashinyan may even win the next election, given that the reaction has been very small to this fall of Artsakh, the Artsakh Republic. And yeah, I guess going back to identity, now the people of Artsakh, given regardless of if they're Azeri or Armenian, will need to, of course, receive Azerbaijani citizenship. They'll need to possibly even learn Azeri, the Azerbaijani language. They'll need to adopt certain traits of Turkic culture, and maybe even their children will travel to Baku to go to university. There's all these considerations that they need to take into account, and we're talking about 150,000 people here, so maybe you can say 75 to 50,000 of them are probably ethnically Armenian, but the rest of them do probably have Azeri-Azerbaijani roots, going back to that 20th century division, since all this land was essentially part of the Eastern Bloc. Soviet Union. So it's a very interesting development that we've seen, and I guess on a very small scale, like we did speak before the stream, Hrvoje, how nation states are kind of maybe falling to the wayside now that multipolarity is here, and now that the world is being divided into larger blocks. Perhaps you can call them these new age empires, and hopefully this isn't again a globalist plan B, but it's in fact these regional empires which help these local cultures thrive while being under this massive political, you can say geopolitical umbrella, whether it be Chinese, Turkic, Middle Eastern, you can say like a big Sunni umbrella, or even in Russia, like a Commonwealth of Independent States of sorts, like what exists between Belarus and Russia today, like it's called the Союзное государство, allied state, or the Commonwealth of Independent States, even though it's kind of dying before our very eyes, but nevertheless, in the future, perhaps there will be a new imperial type model. But going back to the nation state question, Armenia as a small independent nation state, which has almost nothing akin to its neighbors, it's not like its closest Christian neighbor, Georgia, which is also 90, 98, 99% Christian, doesn't relate to Armenia at all, despite the fact that they're only 30, 40 kilometers away. So you can drive to Georgia in about an hour by car. And the Georgians don't associate with Armenians at all. They see them as these like schismatic rejects. And there's no assistance, there's no compassion there. So Armenia is very much alone, the small nation state. And look, the big nations around it simply have decided to take this portion and of Nagorno-Karabakh, the Artsakh Republic, and simply provide it to the Azerbaijani. The deal has been made. Israel has consented. Iran has again consented as well. Surprisingly, Turkey consented, and it seems that Russia has also has given the green light for this particular transaction to go ahead. And so the future of nation states, I think, very much put into question here, because Armenia simply being divided like that. Not to say I'm sympathetic towards Armenia, but simply seeing this occur, I think, is it's very sobering for especially those of us thinking about geopolitics, the big picture, and what the future of international relations may be.
Yeah, I had on Gevor Kalmasian of Syriana Analysis on my podcast a while back. He's great. He's ethnically Armenian. I just saw him on RT, and there was a great. There are a number of things. You probably follow the Twitter account Sprinter, which is pretty big. He summed it up 2 days ago. He said, "What's happening in Armenia?" in one photo, and it's a photo with Pashinyan with George Soros, pretty much. And then Alex Thompson of UK Column, who I'm friendly with, we share each other's stuff. I've had him on my podcast. He shared one of comments from one of his subscribers on Telegram, John Jones, who writes, "The Armenians are caught in a multi-faced device, betrayed by their own leaders, disregarded by Russia, misled by the West, and at the mercy of an ancient and murderous foe." You may have heard of Serbian-based analyst Nikola Mikovic, who writes for me on occasion. He just penned a piece, Nagorno-Karabakh, who is responsible for the Armenian defeat, Pashinyan or Russia. And then The Cradle, which I'm sure you guys read, which is a good outlet. Yeah, Pepe writes, and what's Charmine, I think, heads it up. She's Lebanese, I think. They just published yesterday an article along the same lines of what Nicola wrote for me. Russia's reluctance to secure an indecisive Armenia will weaken both. And so, I think there's a number of factors here. I think one is it's like a war of attrition. A lot of these wars, frozen conflicts, irredentist things that go on for decades, centuries, I think at some point, it does get tiresome. And Nicola often used the words in his articles, capitulate, and it's like in Mexico, lucha libre, like a wrestling match. At some point, one side gets tired and they have to sort of capitulate, and then let's move on with life, and so I think maybe that's what's eventually happening here. And what you mentioned, Dmitry, about nation states, for me, my feeling is, my solace is in, Christ, the Bible, and God. And so not some leader, let's say, like an AMLO or a Putin or a Trump or even RFK Jr. or Lukashenko, who I think, Lukashenko in some ways is cool. He's a cool guy. I've liked some of the things he's done, his attitude and his not locking down and COVID and stuff. But for me, it's like number one is the Bible and Christianity and faith, because even the Eurasian Union, right, which in my mind, it's a supranational globalist project. Supposedly it came about. It was Nazarbayev's idea in 1994. Supposedly, technically he was my employer. I've visited his library foundation in Kazakhstan, which has got all his memorabilia over the years. I've seen I'm not sure if it's open to the public. We had a special event with the kids in the UN, Model UN, but I saw one of his books, which like literally had a title that included globalist or something. You know, he's a full-on globalist, if you ask me, Nazarbayev. But he might be like the type like AMLO, who these globalists are, they're more humane. You know, they're globalists, maybe they're Freemasons or something, but they still kind of want to do some good for the people. Meanwhile, you've got these other like absolutely eugenicist, Malthusian globalists, like the British, you know, the European, British, Washington crowd who just want to like kill everybody. But, you know, the Eurasian Union is, I think, part of this project. And I recently, Klingendale, which is this globalist think tank, which I sometimes follow, they wrote 3 years ago a report that said Eurasian Union is based on the EU model again. So you know what Putin and Nazarbayev or whatever, whoever are now continuing the Eurasian Union project, that's still globalist. And, you know, I have to take the Bible seriously when it says at some point you're going to have the beast is going to take control over all nations, all peoples, you know, rich and poor, doesn't matter. You know, look at the Jack Ma, right? Rich Chinese guy. He went against the regime. They sent him off to teach in Japan, you know, or the same thing happens in the West to oligarchs in America or Europe. And so I think we have to recognize, you know, take the Bible at its word that, yeah, we're going into the crucible, you know, into the global meat grinder, and, you know, come to terms with it.
No, I agree. I think in many ways we have to you know, like I say, put not your trust in princes. You know, we look towards, I mean, we literally just our last Ether Hour episode, we talk about how in many ways the forces on both sides of the war envision is sort of, I mean, you might like the episode, Hrvoje, we talk about the new heavenly Jerusalem plan and how there are multiple billionaire Zionists on the Ukrainian and Russian side, as well as in Israel, that perhaps have a plan for southern Ukraine to turn it into, you know, to turn it into perhaps an Israel 2.0 and, you know, make it, you know, de-Christianize it and turn it into a sort of second Israel. And I believe that those people might have those ideas, but in many ways, what many will for evil, I think God often wills for good. And that's not to say that I believe I'm looking at every conflict and violence happening, like, oh, look, amazing. How is God going to use this necessarily? But we know that God I mean, we've all read the Bible, right? God uses a host of military conflicts and the Roman Empire and everybody to facilitate the spread of the gospel and his word. And, you know, we're in not just a pickle with globalization, but we're in a, you know, a spiritual pickle with people around the world. You know, Hrvoje may not be as bad in, you know, still somewhat Catholic Mexico. I'm sure it still has a lot of problems, but here in America, I mean, it's a spiritual desert, right? And you know, in many ways, we're just you know, as Father Seraphim Rose said, us in the Western countries that weren't under communism are kind of entering the drought that those communist Eastern Bloc countries experienced for so long, and they finally seem to be maybe emerging in a more spiritual light, whereas, you know, we are finally us Christians here are going to be entering our persecution era, unfortunately. As they say, you know, today in Russia, tomorrow in America. That was said in what the 70s, 80s, at the beginning of the Catacomb Saints book published by St. Herman's Monastery. But yeah, Armenia, Azerbaijan, a lot of stuff going on there. Like you said, Dimitri, you point out the rising Turkosphere. You know, Kazakhstan, you know, I'm not fully versed on, you know, Turkish Kazakh relations, but, you know, in theory, you know, from an ethno-linguistic perspective, you know, if there is that super state in Central Asia, I think as a heartland, you know, with fertile lands and, you know, access to water on the Caspian and Mediterranean, that the Turkish world would be quite powerful. I also don't think it would be particularly good for surrounding areas and perhaps you know, Christian minority groups living within that area at all, based on, you know, a historic understanding. But, you know, kind of speaking of the periphery of the Turkish world, I think we want to talk about Crimea. Has been bombarded recently with drone and cruise missile strikes, explicitly like British and American supplied hardware. Really, again, we've talked a lot about, you know, the red lines that keep being crossed to no response from Russia, which, you know, only feeds into, like we said, ideas that maybe certain powers that be are not as serious about their irredentist or their, you know, defensive claims as we might hope they are, you know, protecting the citizens of Crimea, protecting the citizens of Donbass from, you know, Ukrainian Nazi-esque supremacist, you know, just vitriolic terror that we've seen since 2014. You know, we hoped that was the crux of the conflict, right? But unfortunately, you know, citizens, we saw those videos from Johnny Miller. I'm sure you may have seen those on Twitter, Hrvoje. We've been following Johnny for a long time. I mean, he was just by the ocean and by, I mean, I've spent time in the Mediterranean and near the Black Sea than any, cities, Mediterranean dock and coast where families play, and there's just bombs exploding in the air and air defenses, operating directly overhead. Despite how far we are into this war, it's still somewhat bizarre to see.
Yeah, Johnny Miller's great. I love his stuff, and I visited. I went to on 2016. I think it was 2016. I've got Alzheimer's. I don't remember the years anymore. 2016, 17. I went on this trip with Sharon Tennyson. So she's elderly lady now, but since the 80s, she's been doing U.S.-Russia peace diplomacy. She's got the Center for Citizens Initiatives, and she's been taking groups of people back and forth between Russians to America, Americans to Russia, citizen diplomacy. And I signed up for 3 weeks. The year before I went, Ray McGovern went on the trip, who I've interviewed, and I went with Rick Sterling, cool guy, and David Swanson of World Beyond War was in my group. And we went to Moscow, St. Petersburg, and then we broke up. I went to Kazan, Tatarstan. Others went to Crimea and elsewhere. But even I think in Kazan, I met some Crimeans who were saying, we voted. We all were pretty much Russian. We wanted to be part of Crimea. It was, emotional. There were Russians, crying. There was vodka. It was a lot of fun. But, when it comes to what you're saying, the seriousness of Russia, I don't have an opinion. I don't have an answer. There's some people out there in alternative media who say, they've got their thesis. They double and triple down on it, even if sometimes it doesn't really pan out. And, I think there are elements some people think about, money and attention on their channels and stuff. But I don't have an answer. Sometimes I wonder, I've talked to Riley Wagaman and Rodoslavsky and Nikola Mikovic and, the Pepe Escobars and all these people in between. And I try to take everything in, and I'm like, put everything on the table. Okay, what's going on? What's going on? And I can see both, and I think it's still too early in the game, because sometimes you wonder, why is Russia, Paul Craig Roberts, who I've interviewed over half dozen times, he's like, Putin is being weak. That's dangerous, because he's just allowing the crazy Pentagon to just escalate and escalate until we get off to World War III. So, Roberts has got a point. Is Russia maybe weaker than it really portends to be? Or is Russia playing the long game, Sun Tzu type of thing, which, again, there's precedent. Historically, they've done that and they've won, right? With the Napoleon and Hitler, the scorched earth, they pulled into the heart of Russia as the French went into the winter, and that was the winning tactic, right? And so I don't know. Maybe Putin is biding time, waiting for the dollar to collapse. I've interviewed Francis Boyle, who's great, and I used his book Libya on Gaddafi in my courses. I'm in his book. Our interview on COVID went viral in 2020. 300,000 views before it got taken down. I think it was seen by millions. But Destroying World Order, where he explains in 2011, for example, when U.S. NATO they passed that resolution and then bombed Libya. At that point, Russia and China were too weak. They absolutely could not do anything. So they just threw Gaddafi and Libya to the dogs. Russia and China. That's Boyle's thesis in his book, and he's got some authority, and I think it makes sense. And so it's like, at that time, Russia and China were biding time, growing their economy, rebuilding their state and sovereignty, militarizing, right? Building the hypersonics and all that. So I could see that right now still. You know what I'm saying? So they're still militarizing, biding time, letting the dollar slowly decline and the collapse. And so I don't know. Or maybe Russia is weak and incompetent. You see what I'm saying? I don't have an answer. I could see both scenarios.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's the fact that there are so many unknowns, and there's this fog of war, or even you could say cultural, political fog, even those in Russia right now, those living in Moscow, don't necessarily know what exactly will happen a week from now. Like, you don't know if a Prigozhin's going to drive, as we've seen through Rostov and towards Moscow. You don't know if a new mobilization wave will begin, or if there's going to be, say, the bank reforms, like the ruble, for example, reaching 100 rubles per US dollar. Like, that is like, and the central bank in Russia announcing that we're going to float the ruble as an economic strategy. And if any economists are listening, I just want to ask: is floating your primary currency even a valid strategy? Like, is that something you learn in school or university? Because from what I understand, it isn't. Right? It's just bizarre and strange, and so we're not even sure what the central bank in Russia does. And it's not just me talking. Max Kaiser has commented on the fact that, well, no one really knows what the central bank in Russia is doing to the ruble. And Sadgrad has repeatedly like spam, like there's almost 3 episodes a week Sadgrad releases commenting on the fact that the Russian central bank is just not patriotic and it's essentially sabotaging the country, right? But the central bank is essentially, you can say somewhat government controlled, so there should be some at least political say from the Kremlin as to what should take place with the Russian ruble. But again, the country's under massive sanctions, so perhaps they do have some economic, short-term as well as long-term strategy. But the fact that it's unknown, it does lead to ourselves and other geopolitical, you could say, cultural, even political commentators. It does give us some leeway in order to provide speculations. And not all the speculations are unreasonable. Some of them, even the most unreasonable ones, sometimes could come into fruition, I think, especially given the fact that you have, as I said, popular figures like Prigozhin. In June he does something, and in August he's dead, and we don't hear about him anymore. Simply he disappears off the planet because, well, he was killed in a terrorist act, and we still don't know who the perpetrator was. And simply these mysteries will simply exist, and I don't even think we'll actually have answers. And no, we won't get answers as to, well, who exactly tried to bomb the Kerch Bridge, or, for example, we don't know what the Ukrainians have lined up for the Russian side, and we don't know exactly what the Russians have lined up for the Ukrainian side. And even the Russians on the ground, like you see interviews, we've commented on the interview of Gabriel Doroshin, one of the descendants of the Romanovs, and he says, well, during he's been a Donbass, you can say a Donbass rebel, a volunteer in the Donbass wars for about 5 years, and he says there's almost no communication from the high command in Russia, from the military generals. You don't know what the top echelons of military strategy are actually doing. You don't know what a Shoigu or a Gerasimov is planning with the SMO. So if you're just a line man sitting in the trenches, you'll know what your sergeant or your lieutenant or your captain will tell you, but you don't know anything further than that. There's not like a Telegram chat and you have a Gerasimov just like sending it a Discord announcement of some sort, right? It's like that's not how the real world works. And for us, I guess, being analysts, sitting behind the computer, we do have this bird's eye view, whereas someone in the trenches may not have that, especially if he doesn't have an internet connection. So it's we do have, I guess, that freedom, and it is our duty to give an objective or more or less unbiased position. Or we all have biases, so I think as long as we're honest with ourselves and we're speaking in good faith, I think that's the most that can be asked of us. So I think, well, that's why I like listening to your content, Hrvoje, or even Conrad's opinions or Dr. Steve Turley, because they all differ in some ways, but then you can kind of build a bigger picture of exactly what's happening, especially in countries like the United States. Me, myself not being an American, it's harder to grasp exactly what's happening overseas. But in Russia, Russia is, the Russian-Ukrainian conflict is a big question mark. And in fact, could we be moving towards a peace deal? Potentially. Zelensky's speech to the UN has shown that he's actually not willing to go for peace, but it seems like that Europe and the US, it seems like with the lack of support that, kind of the economic package that Zelensky is receiving is not as large as the last one. So perhaps maybe there is some of that pressure to force Zelensky to perhaps sign a peace agreement. You won't get Crimea, buddy. You won't get the eastern regions of Donbass, but you'll just have to settle for what you have now. But on the other hand, you have the Russian side releasing advertisements telling, and in the military recruitment ads, you have the Russian soldiers speaking about how they're going to buy real estate in Kiev and Odessa, which is, if they imagine if back during like the you can say Yugoslavian civil wars, for example, if like in the Serbian military they were releasing videos about how they're going to start buying, Serb soldiers are going to start buying Croatian real estate. I mean, it would be considered almost an act of war and an act of aggression. But today, and it would kind of show on the Serbian side that, look, they'd want to reunited Yugoslavia. But today you have these ads in Russia, and still they kind of tell you that, look, we still don't know if Russia is willing to do that, to go there, to actually escalate the conflict to the point of having an SMO 2.0, having a second mobilization wave. There's a lot of mystery there. And me and Conrad, of course, we we kind of do provide our opinion week to week because, again, some of the news, they do give us, they do shed light on exactly what the top thinkers in Russia are considering. And look, it's not just us who are confused. People like Alexander Dugin, right? The esteemed Eurasianist professor who essentially you can say, was the mastermind behind Eurasianism. And, perhaps he was somewhat of a globalist in the past as well, given his, I suppose, non-Christian materials that he used to write about and speak about. And, it does give the perspective that, look, it's not just us who are confused. It's everybody, frankly. Everybody who, even insiders, don't really know what the main decision makers will be calling for here.
Yeah, I joke about Prigozhin. I might run into him on a desolate Mexican beach. you know Nobody knows, but yeah. And I forget his name. Russell Texas Bentley, I think, the guy from Texas out in Donbass. I've interviewed him,
Yeah,
and
yeah, yeah.
what you mentioned about some of the complaints about the soldiers in Donbass not having any idea what's going on in communications. He's reiterated that same feeling. Yeah.
Well, he's from about 40 minutes from where I live out in Marble Falls. So, I've watched a lot of his content. I remember it was great. I wish his YouTube channel hadn't gotten taken down as fast as it did at the beginning of the special military operation, because it was great content. But the conflict itself, what we're talking about in Crimea, like you said, while on the one hand, the Western sponsors do seem to want to start to take this down, they've given Zelensky so much stuff, and he seems not willing to do so. That, I mean, what they just struck the naval headquarters of the Black Sea Fleet, and caved in the building and hit it with a big Western cruise missile. So the Russians are not hitting those level of strategic targets in Kiev as consistently as the Ukrainians are. And look, we get it. The Ukrainians, getting backed into a corner, perhaps they're getting desperate, and we know that, depending on how harsh this winter is, Russia may make a move sooner rather than later. But again, at a certain level, you have to start to wonder, would a truly patriotic, like a Christian leadership, would this be how they're conducting their special military operation? And look, not a military expert, can't say I know for sure, but I think we can all say that we want to spill the least amount of, the blood of the least amount of young men as possible, and have this be, ended as quickly as possible with the least amount of globalist ramifications in the midst of, the reshufflings that come in large scale conflicts, as possible. So we're always keeping it in our prayers. But to, I guess, move on towards a slightly different part of the world, I think some of the biggest news recently was Bashar al-Assad in China, at the behest of Xi Jinping, got flown out on a very luxurious private, Chinese aircraft. And it appears the first time that he's been in 20 years. And, China really has been thriving in the Middle East more than I've seen almost anything. Of course, we see intense, discussions around the Saudi-Iran stuff, where Saudi saying that they need to get nuclear weapons and nuclear energy if Iran does, and China, just brokered the Saudi-Iranian peace deal. So, Hrvoje, I'm wondering your thoughts on the current situation in the Middle East with Assad and China, and with all those countries around there. We recently saw Netanyahu showing a map to the UN that had all of Gaza and Palestine completely in Israel, which, it's not as extensive as the Likud finance minister showing the map of all of Greater Israel on his podium that one time, but it's a little bit, he's making sure that they show that, they always are showing the correct maps there and everything. So it seems that, things are very much, we talked about Turkey and Azerbaijan, Armenia up there, just south, the Turkish army is active in Syria, and that whole region seems to be in flux.
Yeah, I mean, I've been studying Syria, following the situation for a decade, while I was teaching foreign policy, international relations at the university. I've even had on my program former British ambassador Peter Ford, ambassador to Syria. I got to get him back on. It's been many, many years. And of course, Kevork of Syrian analysis. I'm trying to think, who else I did with my students. I had one of my students had a classmate or someone she knew who was a Syrian refugee many years back. We talked to him. So I've been following this for a while, and it's clearly been a regime change operation against Assad. I even got into trouble because you had the Michael Flynn at my school. Michael Flynn, who was the head of the DIA, Defense Intelligence Agency, and then 2012. There was this document declassified from the DIA, which the document basically said that Saudi Arabia, Europe, I think Turkey, Israel as well, U.S. Intentionally, knowingly, they supported the Salafists, the Takfiri, the ISIS, Al Qaeda. They were doing it intentionally against Syria. And I had a student here in Mexico who was actually an American, and his mother got angry that I was saying the U.S. was financing ISIS. I'm like, it's in the document, And she sent a mail to my higher up saying, "You got this teacher who's an anti-American conspiracy theorist," and I'm like, my superiors didn't care because I was doing a good job.
I think you'll like this story. Just before, I don't want to forget, it has exactly to do with that. It was when I was converting to Orthodoxy. I got catechized at a Antiochian parish in Brooklyn. It was this parish that was almost entirely, ethnically Syrian, and had a lot of people that were, born in Syria and had, come over in the, midst of the civil war and everything. And the Syrian Christians faced a lot of hardship from all fronts, from everybody. They were one of the the Christians of the Middle East have been the ones that have demographically suffered the most since all of the US's and Israel's wars over there. But I went there and I started going, and there are lovely people and everything, but a lot of them still speak Arabic. And, at coffee hour, they'd be a little hesitant and a little suspicious of, Americans. They knew the score, everything going on there. But I talked to some of the more, some of the more outgoing ones. And eventually I was just talking about politics, talking about things. And I don't know how it came up, but I was like, yeah, well, we know, Israel and the United States fund ISIS. And then they all look at me and they're like, about like Israel and the US funding ISIS? I was like, yeah, yeah. And then suddenly they're like, oh, this guy, they're like patting me on the back. They're like, oh, because like they weren't like treating me poorly or anything, but they were just kind of like, does this person really know what's going on? Does this person, understand what, they just kind of had a perspective of the U.S. government and empire that they didn't want to necessarily show an American that was trying to come to their church. But once they understood that I knew the score as well, they were like, "Oh yeah, let's talk about it and do all of this." So it was, I thought that was a pretty funny story.
Yeah, that's hilarious. And you're right. I would tell like my student who's this American, he was purportedly Christian. You just made the great point. When you think about Israel and Palestine, I'm for a state of Israel. I'm not like, the standard fare American evangelicals who, blindly just, you can't criticize the state of Israel. I'm like, well, no, I mean, look what they're doing. Is it Christian or brotherly? What they're literally, people have been living for generations in their house, and the Israeli government is supporting settlers, destroying their homes. That's not Christian. Some of those people are Palestinian Christians. So if you're an American,
it's illegal
Christian,
to preach the gospel. It's illegal to preach the gospel over there. So
yeah. And so I guess my point is like you're saying, a lot of the Syrians the Christian Syrians are dying as a result of the American and European quote democratic governments financing Islamic mercenary jihadists. And so that's absolutely insane. But what you're saying about this now strategic partnership between China and Syria, I often read Sana, the Syrian Arab news agency, is a good outlet. Yeah, I just feel like, going back to prophecy, I could see this, the kings of the East, talks about the kings of the East coming together. It really feels like multipolarity is the kings of the East. Russia, Iran, Syria, China, many more countries in between, Gulf states. It feels like they're coming together. And I do think of the prophecy. Maybe at some point, right now they're coming together. And I think maybe in the future there will be this battle between East and West the will maybe be decimated. And I think maybe there's the prophecy. I'm looking at it now, Isaiah 17. Maybe it was fulfilled previously, maybe not, but it says Damascus will not be a city any longer. It will be only a pile of ruins. Maybe that refers to as a result of some future war. So right now, Syria, China, they're all getting together. Maybe that refers to a future war, but I just see this as more confirmation of countries coming together. And that kind of makes me think the West, things aren't looking good, for the West. Gordon Hahn, I've had him on my program. He's a good analyst of Russia. I think he lives somewhere in Russia, maybe Crimea, I'm not sure. But he just recently posted, he's very academic. He just posted something really good saying that all in all, things just don't look good for the West, in terms of, I'm trying to find the exact quote, but, he's saying, here it is. Globally, the correlation of forces is shifting. And as I have written numerous times, not in the West's favor. So, Syria and China come together, I think that's just another sign of, I worry about at some point the rug's going to be pulled from under Europe and America. The consequence of the Ukrainian war, Europe is being deindustrialized. I've had on Thierry Meyssan, the French intellectual of Voltaire Network, who said that. Guy Meton, the Swiss journalist I've interviewed, who said the same thing. Europe is just collapsing, and America as well. So I think we could also link that to prophecy.
Yeah, that's right. I think living in relative peace for the last, I mean, not to speak, it doesn't speak for everybody, but the majority of the Western world and have been living in relative peace, besides the occasional terrorist act and random false flag by our own governments. And obviously the COVID madness, we've had relative peace and prosperity for the last, you can say, since the end of the Cold War, roughly. And it has kind of put us in this lukewarm state where we forget not just about the Bible and the fact that there are these prophecies awaiting us, and also even the tradition of the Orthodox Church speaks very openly about future calamities coming for us, especially for our internal sins, which we do see our culture degrading to a great extent in the first world, in the English-speaking world. It's almost like a wake-up call is required. And of course, that wake-up call may come from abroad, may come in the form of foreign invasion, foreign destruction. And, for folks listening who think that, well, that's a little bit radical, like that surely won't ever happen. But let's just remember, Conrad said the Christians in the Middle East, they have essentially a capital city, which certainly does not exist any longer, Antioch. So the Orthodox Christians of the Antiochian Church, they live in Damascus now. The city of Antioch no longer existed, has been wiped off the face of the earth by wars, by conflicts, and now, of course, earthquakes as well recently. But simply, God does allow for human sin and human error to God does allow for these. He permits for this evil to take place and for these certain cities to completely be destroyed.
Well, Hrvoje, you mentioned Damascus in ruins and everything, and I think it's just curious how, despite everything, specifically, Netanyahu, the Likud government remains in power. We talk about how Syria, you're right, they're coming together with China and everything. And in a future war, I mean, Israel bombs Damascus and the Damascus airport on an almost weekly basis at this point. And like you just said, Dimitri, Damascus is 25% Orthodox, well, not Orthodox Christian. One of the largest representatives is Orthodox Christian, of course. So it's, a very Christian city in the Middle East, relatively speaking. And we've talked so much on the show about, eventually, we talk, the Antichrist, will eventually reign from a seat in Jerusalem. And there are members of, certain radical, Hasidic sects and whatnot. We've read the articles in Ortho Christian about how for years they've been doing the mock sacrifice. And, we say, no man knows the hour and everything, but on the Temple Mount, they've been doing the mock sacrifice. People have talked about how there are certain people who have perhaps expertly built replicas of the third temple, and they're being stored in warehouses to be moved somewhere. Again, we don't like to speculate too much on these things because, God will reveal those things to us in his time. But Hrvoje, I think you're right. We're thinking of the kings of the East. We're thinking of, based on current governments, who would side with who. I mean, we're seeing, sides that would make sense in a third world war. In some of our Ether Hour episodes, I've shown my schizophrenic World War III map that I made back in 2020, which I'm a little spooked at how accurate it came to be. I made that well before I was one of the people that thought that perhaps Russia wouldn't go in. I had thought they would go in for so long that I was just kind of whatever, maybe it's just never happening. And then it did happen. And that map I made turned out to be, so weirdly accurate. So I'm ready for anything at this point. People always say team, nothing ever happens is the big thing. But, ever since COVID and the Ukrainian invasion, and even since the Trump election, it seems to me that it just gets up right to the point where you think nothing ever happens. And then boom, something sure enough happens. Right. So I think that seems to be the world we're in.
As they say, careful what you wish for. And there's a great documentary on the Shin Bet, right? Like the Israeli domestic intelligence, where everyone should watch it, where I think it was in the 90s, there was this extremist Israeli Jewish group within Israel who plotted to blow up the Al-Aqsa Mosque on the Temple Mount. I think part of it was what you detailed, this desire to eventually recreate the temple for the third time. The Shin Bet had to stop them, right? I don't know if they put them in jail or whatever, but they stopped them. They said if that happened, it'd be World War III. You'd have Muslims not just from the region, but from like the Asian Islamic countries all flooding in, to Israel. It'd be like World War III. So Shin Bet had to I stopped that, and I got to visit the Temple Mount. I think it was 2018, so I got to visit Israel. I stood in the Israeli side of the Golan Heights and visited Bethlehem, and so yeah, I kind of agree with what you guys sort of laid out there pretty much. And yeah, I've read all that stuff that they've got everything ready. They've got the red heifers. They've got everything to recreate the temple. The problem is the Al-Aqsa Mosque is there in the temple. I remember being on the Temple Mount, and I've read this stuff even before going there for many years, that it could possibly be that the previous temple was not actually where Al-Aqsa is, but right next to it. You know, and so, maybe some situation where will happen where they build right next to it, or some, you've got the Abrahamic faith thing. Where's that, in UAE or Saudi Arabia, where they built the three?
Yeah.
You know what I'm talking about. So maybe something like that will allow them to get approval to build the Temple Mount next to Al-Aqsa, or maybe it'll be blown up, and then as a result, we get the third temple built. And so there was an interesting article recently as a result of this deal. Was it IMEC, the India, Middle East, Europe corridor deal, that will situate Israel like at the crossroads of all of this interconnectivity? There was an article saying that, like, back in the 19th century, that there was some rabbi that predicted how Israel and the Temple Mount would be rebuilt, and it would be between all this rail connectivity, and kind of like they were sort of predicting how Israel would sit at the crossroads of all this connectivity that would come about in the future. And so yeah, I think that's sort of the trend we're looking at going forward.
Well, and we also you mentioned those things about the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and St. Paisios predicted that around, I mean, frankly, not so far from our own era right now, that the Al-Aqsa Mosque would be destroyed. And he foretold the Turkish invasion of Cyprus. He predicted the COVID vaccinations and all sorts of things. So I think what he had to say is somewhat important regarding all of this. And he also talked about ultimate war between Russia and Turkey. And you talk about that trade route that Israel is hoping to be at the center of. I see the Turkish world as a crucial part of that. I've mentioned before how, compared to perhaps Persian ascendancy, Arab ascendancy, any kind of Caucasian Christian ascendancy, Russian ascendancy, Israelis seem to be as the most okay with Turkic ascendancy, and the creation of, in Armenia, the taking of Nagorno-Karabakh sets Azerbaijan up strategically to eventually secure a small strip of the southern Armenian panhandle, the Zangezur corridor, to run full supplies, oil pipelines, military through that region to the Caspian Sea. Azerbaijan, main Israel ally, and that's a key to what we're just talking about with these trade routes in Israel. And it's so, yeah, I mean, it's how a lot of this is being shaped up. And again, we talked, that kind of relates to what we were talking about with Ukraine and the new heavenly Jerusalem, with, again, how would that fare into something like this, right? I mean, Crimea, you see people like Gunther Fellinger talking about how Crimea should be turned back into Tatarstan, and, populated and given basically back to Turkey and whatnot. And meanwhile, we've heard about so much, there will be fighting in the Black Sea when it comes to a Turkish-Russian conflict. And we've talked a lot on this show about how, I'm here in America. When things we start to hear about the draft, I'm going to have to talk to Hrvoje about, doing the passport thing and getting other
Come on
places,
down.
because I'm just not interested in getting fried with a directed energy weapon on the Bosphorus Straits. It's just not how I want to go out, especially fighting for this gay country.
Well, we'll have to, I've heard, there was a clip I saw recently, construction workers, they're building the fence, and one of the gringo white guys was telling the Mexican American worker, like, hey, Trump is arrested. Why you keep building the fence? What? Yeah, and he's like, well, the Mexican government is paying for the fence. They're afraid that when the dollar collapses, all the Americans will not fly into Mexico. It's kind of like the day after tomorrow scenario. And then Ron Paul, I looked it up, 2011. I think he made that statement that the wall is to keep Americans in, not to keep us foreigners out. And so, yeah, we'll come on down. I think it's not that difficult for Mexico. You can do the temporary visa, you get the annual temporary visa, it's easy to get, and then you renew it like 4 years, and then you get the permanent. I think after 5 years you get citizenship. So, or just marry a Mexican. 2 years later, you're Mexican.
Yeah, I think it's really important to just consider that Israeli-Turkic alliance in the future, because it is, harkens back to in a way our recent 8 hour episode, which we only released a few days ago, episode 17, which we do speak about that past Khazarian alliance of the Turkic peoples and the former, I guess you can say the proto-Israelis. But so it's not like this hasn't happened in the past, and in fact, we have seen Erdogan in many ways find some sort of connection with Israel. There is that United States middleman, which kind of unites everybody, and Erdogan has been seen as this almost eschatological figure in terms of his impact on his strong policies, some of his strong policies against the Greeks, as well as his, I guess he's sort of like a Middle Eastern juggernaut in a way. Like Russia has to contend with him. Putin's recent meeting with Erdogan in Sochi, having invited Erdogan and meeting with him in person, as opposed to just sending Lavrov, does show that Putin himself needs to make this massive, influential figure. And we've spoken about the Turkey election at length. The fact that it was defining for not just Middle Eastern politics, but also Russian-Ukrainian relations and the war going on right now. I think it's also just in relation to the church. Like you'll probably notice, we do speak about church issues quite a bit and missionary work, things like that. And one of the resolutions to any sort of calamities and conflicts, I suppose, would be maybe providing missionary work to the Muslim Turkic populations of the Middle East and Central Asia, right? Just possibly converting them to Christianity or having them come over to be members of the Christian Orthodox Church, for example. And that simply hasn't been done. And our good friend David Erhan has mentioned many times him living in Istanbul itself, and being a sort of native of Turkey, a native Anatolian, you can say, and being a convert to Orthodox Christianity. He has said that the efforts of the Greek Church in Turkey have been very sparse. There hasn't been, I don't even think there is a Turkish translation of the Bible, like at least a modern Orthodox Christian copy of the Orthodox Study Bible in Turkish. So it is quite strange. It's almost as if, like, prophetically, right, Conrad, like St. Paisius' words, it's not like that's even a good thing, but simply what will take place because there is this absence of work even from our own side in order to convert the people of Turkey. Because look, if like a large percentage of the Turks, or even the Turkey populations, do convert to Orthodox Christianity, maybe there won't need to be a massive war between the countries. Maybe we can resolve things peacefully and amicably, but that's simply not taking place for whatever reason. The Ecumenical Patriarchate is more interested in meddling in Ukrainian affairs and inviting Zelensky over to meet with him at the Fanar in Istanbul, which is very bizarre. But nevertheless, like going into that question of church relations, we've seen probably very controversial. So the Nativity of the Theotokos feast day took place on the 21st of September in, in those of us on the old calendar, and in Bulgaria, actually, on that evening. So the liturgy was in the morning, and that evening on the 21st, the head Russian priest, who was he's the leading priest in the Bulgarian embassy in the city of Sofia, he was actually deported out of Bulgaria officially. They said he was, well, let me just read the TASS article. They said he was a national threat, or he carries a national threat on himself. So Archimandrite Vassian was told by the Bulgarian authorities that he needed to leave Bulgaria, and he's just the priest serving there, and on this wonderful feast day. So finally, even the Bulgarian Orthodox Church and the Bulgarian government somehow are, I guess, maybe it's their EU, NATO ties perhaps, or even Bulgarian history is quite difficult, but we do see pressures on the Russian church. I mean, referencing that article, Conrad, that everybody's been posting from the United States, right? That, look, the US government is finally looking at the Orthodox communities as a potential place of Russian influence. Bulgaria seems to be following along, so it's like maybe it's, again, we were speaking about green lights and red lines, but once somebody gives the thumbs up, like it's like a George Soros or somebody in the World Economic Forum, and everybody around the world simply follows suit and follows the same sort of strategy. So we have Archimandrite Vassian being deported, and in Ukraine, like the persecutions, of course, continue. The Ukrainian government the Ministry of Culture has released a list of 72 churches, most of them quite old, some of them as old as 500 years, that need to be destroyed or moved, so rebuilt, because they simply stand on grounds which should be reserved for other cultural sites, or simply they're just an inconvenience to Kiev, for example. So it's not just the Church of the Times we spoke about last week, which has had incredible miracles occur inside of it, and also miracle working icons, streaming myrrh and people being healed and things like that, demons being exorcised, but also just the government of Kiev seems to completely disregard their own Ukrainian I guess, holy places for what? So it seems like the government is completely anti-Christian. It's not just us who are the zealous people pushing this rhetoric. It's the government itself is seemingly trying to force that. And of course, the bishops being tried at court, Bishop Theodosius of Cherkasy, as the Jewish folks visiting Uman are sort of unmolested and essentially conducting their pilgrimage in Uman. The bishop of that particular territory is being tried in a Ukrainian court for his pro-Russian attitudes and some of the books they found at his inside of his office. So Bishop Theodosius is, again, being included in hearings, and other bishops have sent in character statements, videos. Ukrainian bishops, mind you, native Ukrainian-born priests are sending videos protecting their own hierarchs, saying, "Oh, look, he's actually he was born in Cherkasy. He's a native Ukrainian. He is not pro-Russian. He's just an Orthodox bishop who just speaks his opinion. Why can't he have a certain opinion on, say, the Russian-Ukrainian war or the future of Russia and Ukraine?" Again, these things are not allowed. Free speech is being suppressed on a local level, and it does paint this picture of globalist control. So persecution naturally continues, but there are of course good news. For example, like there was a sermon from the Metropolitan of the Svetogorsk Lavra, which we speak about. That's a Lavra on my. If you go to my Twitter, it's actually our A4 hour display photograph on all the videos. So so our A4 hour Svetogorsk Lavra picture actually, is just that monastery. So in that monastery, the head metropolitan, the head caretaker of that monastery, gave a sermon where he spoke about how the Orthodox faith actually assists the people of Donetsk and Lugansk and has assisted. Like he's given examples. He said that I visited Donetsk and Lugansk many times, and those volunteers who actually practice the Orthodox faith, it has helped with their post-war PTSD syndrome and various other psychological disorders. So actually being active in the Christian faith, a very, very good sermon from Metropolitan Arsenius. And kind of he did say that there was almost miraculous healings as well that happen when people actually attend communion, confession, and this is him speaking about the volunteers and the so-called Donbass rebels who have been at war for almost 8 to 9 years. So you can imagine a large portion of their own lives. And, kids have been born under this. So that's quite positive, amidst all of the destruction going on there. There is the Christian faith is still thriving and still well and truly alive.
Well, I think it's really important that we always give you an update on the persecutions in the church, and the Bulgarian thing is, very disheartening. And, look, the Bulgarians, they've always had their beef with the surrounding Orthodox countries, but, and the Soviet Union time was rough, but they were persecuting everybody. Where's the love for the, liberation from the Ottoman Empire and, all sorts of, the times that they, when they were there for them, we're a family, right? But I think regarding the persecution and whatnot, I want to tease next week's World War Now. We're going to be having another guest, back-to-back guests, almost never seen before, but we're going to be joined by Father John Whiteford, one of a close favorite of the of the show, someone that we really love, and he's going to talk to us about all sorts of stuff in the church, and he's very well educated on all of this. So we're looking forward to all of that. But, we're kind of wrapping up here. Hrvoje, I don't know if you have any thoughts on church persecution stuff in Ukraine. You're a Christian man. I'm sure you're disheartened to see it like the rest of us are. I don't know, maybe you're a much more well-traveled man than me. I think maybe you can tell us if there's any cool Orthodox places you've been as well. We'd love to hear about it.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have much insight into the Orthodox world. It was interesting. Last year, I went back home to Croatia for 3 months, and the local church I attend there, that's Baptist. Usually over the summer, you get an influx of a lot of foreigners, Christian foreigners, and it was there were Ukrainian Ukrainian Christians, Russians at the same time, and from all over Europe. And it was interesting to see that some of them had fled Ukraine and were living in Croatia at the time. But one interesting experience that I did have was, again, when I went to Russia 6 years ago or whenever that was, in Kazan, Tatarstan. We got a tour. Some of the local media and politicians were there. They treated us very well, and they took us to an Orthodox church, and I think it was Kazan, and they explained to us, they may have been the first time I ever was in an Orthodox church, and they explained during the Soviet Union, what had transpired there was, the Soviet Union killed a lot of people. Even the church that I attended, the sister church of the church that I attended in Kazakhstan, that was based in Almaty, they had in a museum. They told me, in the 20th century during the Soviet Union, which Kazakhstan was a part of, that the Christians there, it was like in the 1920s, they put together money. They built a building for their church, Then the Soviet government came and demolished it. Then they saved up money again and rebuilt it. And then it was expropriated by the Soviet government. And then at some point, they came in. I don't know what year that was, 40s, 50s, or 60s, or whatever. They took all of the men, dozens of men, 30, never seen again, and that was in Kazakhstan. So in Kazan, they told us that they filled the church with believers. It was a relatively small church. And they told us that it was filled like sardines in a can. Like if you imagine the space of the church where they just filled it with all of the people standing, but they were all just shoulder to shoulder, like sardines in a can. And then they took him up to the bell tower and threw them down and killed them. And that the grounds underneath the church that's where they were buried. Like it was filled with bones. And so it was really, on my trip to hear this story told to us in Kazan at the Orthodox Church, that this is what the Soviet government did to some believers. So, that was like jaw-dropping moment. But to end on a lighter note,
Yeah.
I when it comes to Ukraine, I feel a bit, I think it's in good hands. You probably saw the news. Zelensky has asked Serbian Satanist occultist Marina Abramovic to be an ambassador for Ukraine. So, I think we're gonna be all right.
Maybe that's why the polls, we hate on them on this show, but maybe that was what pushed them over the line. Maybe that's why they're like, you know what? No, we're done supporting Ukraine now. You brought Marina Abramovich on. That's we could hope their motives would be oh so noble. But with all of that, thank you so much for coming on, Hrvoje. This has been a delightful conversation. I think we've perfectly timed the timing of this conversation, perfect length to this episode. So I would love to. Well, Dimitri, I'll give you the opportunity to say anything else on what we're saying, and then we'll close this out.
Yeah, I think a lot has taken place this week, but we pray that everybody's safe, and everybody attends church, whichever Christian denomination you belong to. Definitely keep reading the Bible and keep discerning. Of course, stay open-minded. We of course all agree that we do need to fight against this globalist technocracy that's being built, not just in the West but also in Eastern countries. I think all around the world there are it's like tentacles on an octopus, right? It's like you just have to kind of fight the tentacle that has been given reign over you, locally, and you do what you can, of course, in your own power, and God willing, we'll all come out on top at the end of the day, even in terms of this information warfare, which is happening, at least online, where we kind of fight our battle. And in saying that, I think it has been officially 1 year since mobilization has begun in the Russian Federation, and since Surovikin took control of the SMO. And it has been exactly 1 year, actually, on this episode, that me and Conrad agreed to start the World War Now show. And actually, we recorded our episode, I believe, end of September last year, our first World War Now episode. As a part, you can say almost a part of the World War Now lore is that as the Russians began mobilization, we mobilized to fight the info war, which is very romantic, but I think it does speak a lot as to our attitudes towards all of this. It does, what's happening in the world, at least since the time of COVID, I think we have seen an escalation, and Hrvoje has confirmed that, look, this escalation is in fact real. It's not just our minds are not just delusional. We're not just incredibly critical of what's happening in the world. We're not just sort of members of the opposition opposing our local governments. No, in fact, I think what's happening in the world is very important. We need to pay attention to some of these critical details, and having these guests on the show, having you listeners, of course, participate and give us feedback. It does paint a bigger picture for us of exactly which events are taking place and transpiring, especially from all around the world. We like to hear different opinions, so we appreciate our Greek commentators, those of you from India, China. We have commentators who literally message me on Twitter, for example, and they just speak in their native languages, and I just have to translate the tweets because it's technology allows us to communicate globally, which is, it's not really globalism, but it's more like the benefits of technology assisting us in spreading our opinions without forcing it on one another. But yeah, we definitely appreciate your time here, Hrvoje and Conrad. Really, really good input. I mean, it's been an awesome week, and we hope that you guys enjoyed the episode.
I think this has been a great thing to happen in our year anniversary. I remember right after releasing that article and episode, Hrvoje messaged me and was like, World War Now, like, this is such a great idea. Like, I basically totally agree with your premise. And I'm like, thank you, somebody that gets it. Like, that was like my first thought, was like, I'm not crazy for thinking that we've already entered, the Third World War. It just hasn't entered, its hottest phases yet. But With all of that, Hrvoje, plug anything you want. We'll have it all linked below, and send the people off with your final words.
Yeah, I actually feel special now being on around the 1 year mark. And yeah, I in the earlier days I was able to keep up with your podcast, but when you got a kids and I can't keep up with anything these days, TNT, geopolitics, kids, but I was listening to the free preview of your Aether Hour. So keep up the great work, love your stuff. And you guys are, I mean, you guys are welcome anytime on my TNT radio and even Geopolitics and Empire. Just the website's geopoliticsandempire.com, tntradio.live. I'm on there daily for 2 hours, and I just started a Substack as well, so people can support as well if they feel they get value through those websites. And yeah.
We'll have the Substack on our recommended Substacks. We make sure only the best of the best are on our recommended Substack because we actually
I
drive a lot of
will
traffic there. So
I will add
we'll
you
have you
guys
on
to
there.
mine right now too.
Yeah. So be sure to subscribe to Hrvoje's stuff. He really has a broad spectrum. Like again, the Geopolitics and Empire Telegram, frankly, is just one of my favorite Telegram channels to just follow and stay up to date with. So do that. We'll have it linked below. And with all of that, you know where to find our stuff: worldwarnow.substack.com. Follow us on Telegram, World War Now Telly. Follow us on Twitter at World War Now _. Follow me on Twitter at GnomeRad. Follow Dimitri on Twitter at OCanonist, the Orthodox Canonist. Follow us on Rumble, World War Now. Subscribe to the YouTube channel. We're getting closer and closer to 3,000 subscribers. So get us over that line. Maybe we'll do some more live streams, do a 3,000 subscriber live stream. You guys like the streams. So we'll get back on that. Maybe some Twitter spaces. Yeah, expect Father John next week. We've got a lot of guests on Aether Hour coming up. Don't want to spoil it too much, but crazy slate of guests. So be sure to get behind the paywall. Check out our most recent episode about New Heavenly Jerusalem, really controversial, spicy stuff. So don't expect to see too much of it on YouTube. But with all of that, like, subscribe. Thank you so much for listening, and God bless.
Thank you, guys.